So I wanted to get a sense of your journey as a Mormon. You told me about your experiences growing up as a Mormon and how you discovered Vedic Dharma. And if you can just speak about what was that journey like and what made you seek out something different.
I think from the time I was very young, I was always interested in what is real and what my experience is. My favorite activities in the Mormon Church were girls' camp, where we were out in nature, and some of the activities where we were really engaged in water sports or other activities. Then I think my desire to be engaged in things that are real was integrated into my experience of the church. So the Mormon Church has kind of a unique way that they teach prayer, where you pray in more of a conversational way. And so I really took that to heart, and I really prayed to God in a way that it was like a friend of mine that I would go to for help and advice and counsel. So I think what really probably was some pivotal changes for me was my experience in natural childbirth, both giving birth myself, and then also I was a birth doula, so I went to many, many births to see other people's experience. So that really helped me to be more able to follow my intuition.
So speak about you were mentioning your experience in childbirth and how that impacted.
Now, actually, that was really interesting because I first became pregnant. I got married very young. I'm a Mormon kid, of course, at BYU. And so I was still in my undergrad when I was pregnant. And so as per the course of the way I was taught to go in my life, I just asked someone who did it before me, who is your doctor? And she gave me a contact. And so I went to this doctor, and immediately when I met him, I mean, he was good looking, but other than that, I really didn't have a good feeling from him. And when I asked him questions that I was reading in my natural childbirth book, he was very defensive and insisted that there was no such thing as drugs, it's only medication. And he just had to keep correcting me, which I thought was kind of strange, like, whatever you call it, it's okay. But anyway, I basically with my first birth did whatever other people said I should do, and it turned out to be a pretty difficult and traumatic experience for me. And then there was a friend of mine in my ward who had her baby at home, so I had gone to her house and seen the complete radiance on her countenance explaining this magnificent experience of having her child at home and how beautiful it was. And I could feel, even it was like 3 days later, and I could feel the just intense peace and beauty in that home. It was just incredible. So I kind of wanted something like that, but I still wasn't quite ready to trust my instinct enough to just say, I'm going to have this, because that was really not the cultural norm, and I don't think I would have had I know I wouldn't have had the cultural support with my family and my friends. But I started... So because my birth experience was so difficult for me, I knew I wanted something different, so I did consult my own intuition. And how my intuition started developing is another story, which is kind of fun. But so I had this intuition, and I remember one day I was driving down Highland Drive in Atlanta, Georgia, and I saw the sign prenatal yoga. This was when I was pregnant the second time, and I thought, yes, I'm going there. So I went and started prenatal yoga. That was how I started yoga. And that really gave me an experience of being in tune with my body. And I realized actually that's what I needed. And then once I was in tune with my body and I could discern a little bit better, I found a physician who had a midwife practice. And I selected that practice, and it ended in a very beautiful, very empowering birth experience where I was able to, again, understand the interplay of me and the world, or God, me and universe, me and other. I was able to really feel those two and experience them and really trust myself and realize what an integral part of the world I am and how my experience is really what's most important and what I have to always consult in order to move forward.
So this is kind of unusual. You're talking about your journey through childbirth, bringing you to a path of Hindu Dharma, but how it's still not clear how the two relate. How is it that your experience of yourself, or even by taking the yoga class, what led you to question the paradigm that you were in? And as I understand, you were quite a serious Mormon.
Yeah. So in Christianity, there's a famous saying, "Behold the condescension of God." And my interpretation or my understanding of this is talking about that God gave his son to come to earth and serve us, die for us on the cross and for the atonement to be there so that we can all be saved. So the condescension of God, that God would actually interact with man for man's sake. So what was interesting is after my third birth, which was a home birth and an amazing beautiful experience where I really had to trust my instincts and just stand up to my husband and my community and just say, I'm going to do this, I feel good about it, this is what I'm going to do. And they ended up supporting me, sort of a little reluctantly, but I ended up having enough support to have that home birth, and that really got me to trust that when I follow my instinct, when I follow what I feel inside is right after studying and searching, I get a much better result. So then I became a birth doula. So as a birth doula, I started attending all kinds of births. And that was extremely fascinating because some of my clients were Jehovah's Witnesses, some were Muslim, some were Christian, some were atheist, some were just agnostic, some were nature lovers, some were really into technology. They were so diverse. And this was interesting because what I experienced was at every single birth there was some presence there which I would call divine. I would call that there was some divine presence at every single birth. But what I noticed was, depending on the family and what their style of spirituality was or their style of living, that divinity showed up in a unique way. So if the family was very playful, there would be a joyful, exuberant, light feeling of divinity at the birth. And if the family was very serious, very religious, it would be a more somber, maybe even deeper, but a very different flavor of divinity would be there at the birth. And as I went through the experience of birth with each of these families, is one of the most in touch with God, I believe, experiences that exist. And most people who've been there at the birth of their child would agree. It's really an intense interchange of God and man there. And so then I had a real, excuse me while this garbage truck goes. So then I had a real experience teaching me that divinity is unique to each of us, and that I started to interpret the scripture, behold the condescension of God, that God is there for each of us in the way that we can receive. And I started to realize what a unique relationship that is between God and man. And when I realized that, I started to really trust that I could also be unique. And somehow it dawned on me through all those experiences, and this might sound funny to all of you that aren't Mormon, but it was a huge eye-opener when the one day I realized God isn't Mormon.
Huh.
Whoa, that was a shock. I just realized it. It can't be so. It can't be that God is... Okay, now there's...
I think this is such a big revelation that the universe wants to put a lawnmower thing in the back to prevent it from being heard. So,
Actually a leaf blower. There are no leaves, so hopefully this guy will leave soon.
yeah, I mean, from somebody who grew up in India, that is a very strange idea, because from our point of view, what you're what I'm hearing you say is that you got to this understanding that the divine is more universal. Um, so can you speak a little bit more about what uh, what was the teaching, or what was your idea before you got to this idea that actually the divine is present everywhere and in all different religions and different settings of this birth process?
So growing up, my family went to church every Sunday, and in the Mormon church, that means 3 hours every Sunday. As a teenager, once I started my freshman year, so that would have been about 14 years old, I started going to morning seminary. So it was a 1 hour Sunday school, quote unquote, Sunday school type lesson, which was every single school day morning. So I would go to the church at 6 a.m., learn about, there were 4 years. So the first year I learned about the New Testament, and then the second year I learned about the Old Testament, and then the third year I learned about the Book of Mormon, and then the fourth year I learned about church history and other, there are 2 or 3 Mormon scriptures that are unique to Mormonism, so besides the Book of Mormon. So those scriptures were covered that year. So besides that, well, I think I'm going to have to go inside because this leaf blower is coming now around the front.
Sure, maybe you have to go inside where
Actually, he's just
it's a little
walking.
quieter.
He's walking by. So after graduating from Mormon seminary in high school, where I won the regional speech competition, so I was involved, very dynamic, engaged in Mormonism, very active. I used to go to all the church dances. So I joked, I was actually at church every single day of the week. Sunday was 3 hours of church. Saturday was church youth dance, and then Monday through Friday was seminary. So I was very active. And of course, upon graduation, I went to BYU, the church school, where again I studied. And I also started going to the Mormon temple, which is about a 4-hour session of teaching and practice. A lot more practice. Some ritual in the temple, which is a little more common in the East, I think. Not so common in Christianity to have so much ritual.
So let's speak a little bit about the temple. So as I understand it, not every Mormon can even go to the temple. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I actually really like the idea of the temple in that it's like kind of like a grad school. If you want to go, you're welcome to. There's different standards and there are different choices you need to adhere to if you go. But I really like the fact that it's completely voluntary, and when you go there, it's kind of nice because you get a caliber of people that are really sincerely interested in their spiritual development, because otherwise it's really boring and nobody's going to bother because you don't get that much social mileage out of going to the temple. But really it's just mostly, for me anyway, it was a personal choice, and I appreciated the opportunity because it's really quiet there, and they provide a place where really meditation can be experienced. And I don't know how many people experience meditation there in the temple, but I think I started to taste it indoors. The only other times I felt meditation was on a long bicycle ride or in nature hiking. But in terms of being in a building with people, Mormon temple is really a peaceful and silent place. So I appreciated having that. I think that really actually helped me with that self-reference, looking inward, looking inside, and discerning what is my experience. The Mormon
And
Church is also
not everybody, as I understand it, not you need to have some kind of certification or to go to the temple, right?
right, correct. Which
How
is
does that work?
I appreciate it because then it just weeds out people who really don't care about spirituality, in my opinion. I mean, in Mormonism, their flavor of spirituality has a lot of obedience factors to it. So you have to commit to certain obedience factors in order to go. Being modest and being chaste. You know, like if you're sexually active, it will be only with your spouse and not somebody else's spouse, or that kind of thing. But they're kind of basic. I mean, if you're living a Mormon lifestyle and you're really into it, it's a no-brainer. It's really easy. You go in there, yes, no, yeah, yeah. You get your certificate and you go. So it's only for people who really don't want to. They're not sort of with the program. They don't anyway want to go, so it's not an issue.
Okay, okay. So there are just certain rules you have to follow.
Yeah, it's a lifestyle. You need, for instance, the 10% tithing in the church is totally voluntary. However, if you want to go to the temple, as I recall, you need to be a full tithe payer, which means you need to pay 10% of your income to the church. That's one of the recommend, or what do you call it? One of the standards that I recall. That and believing in God and those kind of things.
So great. So can we continue the story, which is absolutely fascinating? You mentioned so your first experience that the words you used was the first experience that God was a Mormon came through your birth
Yeah.
experiences, and
Mm.
again from an
Mm.
Indian point of view, that's it's kind of par for the course. You assume that everybody has access to the divine. There's no proprietary
Mm.
sense of it. So speak a little bit about then how what was the next steps on your journey from discovering that the divine is more universal?
At the same time that I was discovering these things through birth doula, I was also, this yoga really stuck with me. So I really enjoyed my prenatal yoga class. I took their postpartum class also, and then I continued yoga classes. And that was in Atlanta. When I moved to Boston, Massachusetts, I started again doing even more yoga, and then I decided to branch out and go to a yoga journal conference. Well, at the yoga journal conference, I met yogis who really integrated spirituality with being, with action, and that was really awakening for me. I was so ripe for that kind of thing. I can remember spending an all-day workshop with Adil Pakabala, who's actually from Seattle here, and his integration um, of the yoga posture and practice with being, with spirituality, with choices, with daily living, um, just really, really woke me up. I mean, I can remember actually thinking, oh, this guy needs the Book of Mormon. He'll be so enlightened. And I think I remember coming and talking to him and, introducing the Book of Mormon to him, and he was just gracious about it, but clearly he didn't feel any need to go that way. But it was kind of sweet. I'm still in this paradigm of the Mormonism is the only way, and yet I'm discovering this amazing practice. And, something he said, so Adil is really into Iyengar yoga, and Iyengar yoga is about precision. It's about doing things correctly. If you don't do them correctly, you might get injured, and this is a problem. So in this sense, this is a little similar to Christianity, because Christianity is about protocols and doing things properly and being obedient to certain laws and principles. So I'll equate these two. For me, it was similar. So Adil went through the whole day explaining the intricacies, for instance, of warrior pose and how your hips need to be independent of each other so that they can properly distribute the weight and the energy that you're holding through your body when you're in this posture. So he went through really, really fine-tuning of certain postures all day long, and it was so enthralling to hear his reasoning. And at the very end of this workshop day, he says, your posture doesn't matter. And I'm like, what? You just spent this entire session, I was just holding on to your every word, and now you're saying it doesn't matter? He's like, yeah, it really doesn't. What your practice is, it just doesn't matter. That's not what's important. He said, what is important is what are you becoming as a result of your practice. And that was like, oh, okay. Then I was able to really loosen up on myself. Instead of like, I must be to church on time and I must do everything that I'm told, I realized, like, wait a minute. If I'm so uptight about being to church on time, I'm yelling at my husband, I'm yelling at my children, feeling frustrated, I show up to church all uptight, like, okay, so I made it in time for the sacrament, but I'm feeling really terrible, and so is my whole family. So I was able to really start to realize, okay, so it's my experience that's more important than, the hard line, what am I doing? And that, it helped me to really recalibrate and not too far into this process of starting to understand that my relationship with God is much different than I was told. I was also in a really tough marriage, and a lot of that had to do with my paradigm of wanting to do the right thing and help someone else. So I was in a tough marriage, so I decided, you know what, I'm not going to complain to my parents, I'm not going to complain to my friends at church because, you know, I want my husband to feel accepted at church. I don't want people to look at him funny. I don't want to tell my friends who aren't Mormon because then they'll think, oh, Mormon couples have problems. So pretty much I couldn't think of anybody that I felt comfortable telling my problems to. So I used to go on long, long walks in the Boston winter. I'd put on 2 coats, actually, and 2 hats. And I would just walk for hours and I would pray and I would cry and I would just ask for help. And I started to really feel in touch with something to where whenever things were very difficult at home and I would pray, something would shift. Either my husband would suddenly be nicer, or I would just be stronger and I would be able to handle it. And I realized, okay, there's some dynamic here because every time I kneel down, every time I pray and ask for help, something changes, something shifts for me. So then I started to get a lot more confidence in my personal relationship with God. And so as my marriage was breaking, of course I didn't realize that's exactly what was happening, but as I was discovering my own internal power, it was making my husband even more uncomfortable with me. And I was finding different lectures, different books from the library. I found a book called Commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. What was interesting about this book that I found is that I used to reserve books at the Belmont Library. I lived in Belmont, Massachusetts, and I'd get email notifications, your book is in. And when this email notification came, I swear to you, I did not reserve that book. It just came. So I thought, well, this is interesting. I know I'm on a path of discovery, but this is the first time a book is coming to my email inbox, and I never ordered it. So I got this book. I think it was by Ram Dass. And I think he might be from a Christian background. He comes from a Western background, definitely. And reading that book started to really connect some dots between Christianity and this other Vedic wisdom path, which I was just barely starting to sniff. Another book I found was called Radical Forgiveness, and it was again from someone from a Western Christian background who discovered Buddhism and how acceptance of everything inside of ourselves is so incredibly important. And so the shoulds and the oughts started to fizzle away. I realized they were really not serving me, and that gave me a little bit more fire to be able to explore even more outside of my comfort zone. So I can remember a really pivotal time. Do you want to hear it?
Yeah, absolutely. I also want you to speak a little bit about this in some way, a summary. So you're saying that for you, the journey was moving from something which was more commandment based into trusting your own self. Can you just speak a little about that? What was it? What was the model that you were brought up in, and then what was different about your exploration from how you were told things were?
Well, a lot of our universe is created by our mothers. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, an artist, and she was brought up in England, went to Catholic school, and I think that paradigm, Church of England, Catholicism, Mormonism, kind of all in one, um, passed on to me was really about we are unworthy before God, and we need to prove ourselves by being obedient to commandments and by being faithful. And, as a child and as a teenager, that served me. It really did. I have to tell you, I was very disciplined. I exercised regularly. I never used any drugs or alcohol or anything. I never felt inclined to. And my church was really set against it. It was also set against having sex outside of marriage. And so I was like, well, okay, I don't find guys all that attractive anyway, so I'm cool with that. So I think it helped me to be more focused on girls' choir and focused on my academics and on sports. It helped me to, I think, be a little bit more balanced emotionally. For me, I know I wouldn't have been able to handle being intimate when I was in high school. It would have really blown parts of me open that were not ready to open. So So I really appreciated that. And I do want to share this little story. I was saying there's another story about my intuition, because I think this is an important piece here. So I think I grew just growing up having feeling a connection to natural things and feeling a connection to the natural world. I think that naturally helps people to be a little more trusting of their instincts. When I was in girls' choir, we were a very competitive choir. We used to go to world competitions, and our conductor was extremely strict, extremely meticulous, and he had a temper like, oh, legendary. He would scream and shout and jump up and down, and this was a huge man. Like, we're talking 250 pounds of jumping up and down and screaming, and it was so intimidating. I was a second soprano. So second sopranos, they don't sing the melody, they don't sing the harmony. There's another thing, and it's really it takes a really good ear to hear that. And his ear was so impeccable, so perfect. He would scream at us, the whole second soprano section, and individually he would pick us out because he could hear if we were off. And not only would he scream at us individually, but then he would make all of the choir be silent and listen while he had us sing individually, and he would have us do it again and again until we got it right. And I mean, girls would fall apart. Of course, you have a teenage girl, and he'd say, "It's only your ego that's stopping you from doing this right. Now drop your ego and sing." It was so scary for us. So my ear really was not perfect. It really could not hear the distinction of sound that he was wanting us to live up to. But I didn't want to be yelled at. So what started to evolve in me was an ability to feel when the pitch was perfect. I could feel it on some other level, some vibrational level, some intuitive level. I could feel it was brighter, it was a little higher, it was a little more expanded. And that brighter, higher, more expanded feeling is kind of like, anyway, it's like when you're getting closer and closer to something and somebody is telling you, like, getting warmer, getting warmer, getting warmer, you found it. It's like that. So as a teenager, I started to really hone in on this ability to feel what's right and what's not right, just based on how it feels to me. So that came from my girls' choir experience, and it really went into my ability to start exploring my world. So now I have some books I'm reading that are helping me to see my interaction between behavior and between experience and between law and how those can interplay. I'm having yoga, both yogic wisdom and also my experience of yoga, which I started to integrate my own home practice an hour a day. And then I had my doula experience. My doula experience giving me an experience, a real tangible experience of what divinity is. And all of these things started to come together to help me to break out of my paradigm. It is something more real.
So this, I want to explore just a little bit more of the paradigm, simply because from my own background, which is growing up in India, it's very, it took me actually a long time to even realize that people would think that, for instance, God is Mormon. To me that's so far out that it's almost hard to understand it. Can you speak a little bit about what did that actually mean to you? What does it mean? I mean, well, from a Christian point of view, what does it mean to be Christian in that particular aspect, and how does one look at the other people who are not Christian?
Um, well, Mormonism is very evangelical, and they believe that we should spread the gospel to the whole world and to everyone we know, and that even we should have everyone baptized, including our ancestors or people who have passed on. They should all be baptized, and that only through baptism can we take advantage of the atonement of Jesus. So the atonement of Jesus meaning that we all have faults, and that those faults will take us to hell unless somehow we're saved. Somehow there's an intermediary. This intermediary is Jesus. And only while the sacrifice has been made, the example has been set, the path has been given, we have to follow by that being baptized and going down that path in order to take advantage of going to heaven. Mormonism has a slightly more elaborate, I think, idea of this, because then there's 3 kingdoms of heaven, and even people who aren't baptized get to go to a lower kingdom, but it's still heaven. So they have a slightly more, I think, forgiving model than some other religions I think are really like heaven or hell. But anyway, it's very clear from a young age that the highest degree of heaven is the most attractive. It's the only degree of heaven where you get to be in partnerships, men and women, in marriages and families. That's their whole, families are forever. That's only in the highest degree of heaven. If you're in a lower degree of heaven, you're just on your own. There's no family. So it's not as appealing. So in that sense, it's just taught from a very young age that you want to be in the highest degree of heaven, and then all of the ways of getting there, what you need to do to have a temple marriage, to keep the commandments, to do good works. All this is taught to you from a very young age, and it's all based on that we lived with Heavenly Father before we were born in heaven, and then we came in here and forgot everything before, and so that we could have a trial of our faith to see if we would still follow Jesus and not Satan, even that we're here and we really can't see Jesus and we really have very little experience of that. And then all the teaching is just to be able to keep these rules and regulations and this lifestyle in order to make it back to heaven, to live with Heavenly Father forever and ever and ever and ever. So if you're good, if you keep the commandments for this short lifetime, then the rest of eternity you get to be in heaven and in the presence of God. So it's a good deal. Like, hey, okay, so I'm not going to drink or smoke or sleep around, but then I have all of eternity to be joyous and happy. So it's just this little bit of time I have to be obedient and do these things. Hey, that's no big deal. I can do that.
And so how does this translate into how other cultures or religions are looked at? The sense is that the others
It's a, what do you say? It's a field of possibility. We can bring our missionaries anywhere and spread the gospel. So
right, but the idea is that those other people are not then going to heaven because they
well,
haven't.
they're going to lower degrees of heaven. So if we want them to join us in the highest degree of the celestial kingdom, then we have to introduce these things to them. And if they accept them, then they can join us there.
Right. But also I wanted to understand when you said God is a Mormon, what does that really mean, and what was that experience, or what was the teaching that would lead you to believe something like that?
Everything. With God, the head of the church, is telling, here are the commandments, here's my true church, here is the way it's all laid out, this is the right way. And clearly God must be Mormon, right? It was part and parcel of everything. Nobody would ever consider otherwise. If God
Right.
isn't Mormon, then you could go to some other church or some other cult or what. You could just have no church. You could just go out in nature. That's ridiculous.
Very.
People in the container is just absolutely one of the fundamental principles, which is so fundamental. It's not even a teaching. It's just part of the oxygen, which is God is Mormon. God is the head of the Mormon movement.
Right. And if you were looking at it on a wider Christian level, it's God is Christian, right? Uh,
Oh, definitely, yeah. Unfortunately, I think the wider view isn't really promoted. I think Mormonism, one of the things that has been criticized in some of the professors at BYU, I know that have been dismissed, are professors that really want to take a wider view of things. And they've been kindly asked to leave because the Mormon paradigm doesn't have a lot of room for a wide scope. And that's probably another reason that I was always destined to leave, to graduate, to become a Mormon alum, as I call myself. Because I always made sense of the world with the broad picture, with the bird's eye view. I always like to zoom out. Even when I'm studying with a study partner, I always want to zoom out. Okay, let's understand. What is this really about? How is it applicable to us? Let's understand a context before we go into detail. And if you do that too much in Mormonism, and probably in most Christian religions, most paradigms, You go too deep into it without zooming out, you can get really lost really fast. But if it doesn't hold true to the broader view, then you want to keep people really honed in on the fine details and the narrow. You don't want them to zoom out too much.
Mm.
So it's easier just to say God is Mormon, and then can only zoom out as far as the church.
Very interesting. So the impetus then for the missionary work is that in some ways it's an obligation to save the other people who are not yet saved.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, a lot of Mormons are a little self-conscious and they don't want to do missionary work because it's uncomfortable for them. And so there is that sense of duty in that. But it's also, it's kind of in a sense of adventure because, for instance, I met a friend recently, just last week I was in Utah, and I met someone who had lived his entire life in Springville, Utah, which is a very small town, except for 2 years where he went on a church mission to England. And really, I've met so many people when I was living at BYU and when I was in Utah with that same story. They're from a very small paradigm, a very small box in the world, and yet they had 2 years where they were able to experience different ways of being. And so this actually, I think it helps. I think it helps the culture because every young man is highly encouraged to go. Now even young women are encouraged to go so that it brings, you have some sense of there are other people and they're good. Because if you're living there for 2 years, you really get to know people of that culture. Of course, when it goes a little too far is when they end up marrying someone from that country, and sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I definitely saw at least a couple of my friends when I was living on the East Coast that left their husbands, so they just couldn't handle being married to a straight Mormon guy. They had to go back. One went home to Sweden, one went home to Brazil. They were just like, forget this. I just can't do this anymore.
So
But
that's kind of funny because what I'm hearing you say is that the mission people are going out with at least the concept of saving other people, but what is really happening is that they are being saved in a way from,
anyway,
their world is expanding and they're being saved from their sort of narrow boxes.
yeah,
Very, very fascinating.
yeah,
So, uh, I mean, from an Indian point of view, we've always looked at a missionary activity as somewhat destructive in terms of destroying native cultures, in
mm,
causing people to move away from their ancestral traditions.
mm.
Um, and I wonder how that gap can be bridged to bring some of that understanding to the people who are actually engaged in missionary activity, which is generally seen, I think, in the West as a positive thing only.
But I think that first the idea, and I definitely got this from my public school education in Washington State, that uh, primitive cultures are primitive, and that we are an evolved culture, and that we are definitely superior, and that if the primitive cultures are capable of understanding complexity of our culture, that we should share and that we should teach them. I definitely got that growing up. And in fact, this idea of there being something sacred, something that one would benefit from retaining in a primitive culture, this is a new concept. I never heard this concept before I came outside of the Mormon paradigm. So this was all through my public school. This was all through my Mormon upbringing, not even smelled of. I mean, there are some, I think, regulations in the Mormon Church where they don't go out and actually knock on doors in certain countries, and they try to teach families because they had some experiences where they did realize they were breaking up families. But for the most part, this idea that there was something sacred in the native culture, totally foreign. Also, Seattle Girls Choir, that was another cultural experience because we sang a lot in different languages about different ways of being. But still, this idea that there was something worth retaining in a primitive culture, I mean, just the idea of primitive, right? It's like, it's primitive, evolved.
Right, right. So that very idea that that there is the primitive culture of so-called others, and ours is the evolved culture. That itself is coming from where is that coming from?
It was part of the air I breathed. It came from everywhere, every direction.
Hmm.
I can remember in sixth grade in our social studies class, and in sixth grade, we had the same teacher for every subject. So only in seventh grade did you get actually specialized teachers. So my teacher breaks out the McGraw-Hill packet of social studies, and there are these cards with photos on them. Photos of Africans picking lice out of each other's hair and eating them. And of course, what are we thinking as American sixth graders? That's so disgusting. That's so primitive. I can't believe it. Is that real? We had such a sense of superiority. And these are the images that which we were shown. We were never shown dances or healing modalities or the way that the communities interacted with each other or the structure of the community. We didn't even know that there was anything different than us. We just figured it was like us, except they had these really weird things they did, like pick lice out of each other's hair and eat it. Like, how disgusting. I mean, of course that's gross. Nobody wants to be like that. We need to help them to be like us.
And so to be like us is one or the other form of conversion, whether it's from a religious point of view or from another point of view.
Honestly, what I got growing up, and I don't remember, this is kind of due to an absence of being taught, rather more so than being told specifically. There's no such thing as there is nothing else. There's no primitive culture. There's nothing. It's just they're in a vacuum. They don't have what we have, and we need to share what we have with them. It's like we have a refrigerator full of fruits and vegetables, and their refrigerator's empty, and we're just going to share our fruits and vegetables with them. That's all. Their refrigerator is empty. That's what we're taught. They don't have any resources. They don't have a culture. They don't have a God. They don't know anything of God. They know nothing. We need to teach them.
Hmm. So it's the idea that we have God, they don't, they're kind of godless, and we need to share, we need to bring our God to them.
Yeah, we have to bring our meaning theirs as well. They just don't know it yet.
Right, right. Very fascinating. Well, I think we'll continue our series on your discovery of Dharma. Thank you so much for this very, very useful session, and we'll catch up with you pretty soon.
Thank you.
Bye.